The other funny finding, which was replicated by Gallup in a global thing last year, is do you know where people find their inspiring leadership?
At home.
At home and in family.
Welcome to Future Fit Leadership, a podcast for emerging, experienced and executive leaders to build community, grow capability and future focus their career pathways. There has been a global shift in how we lead, and our conversations with leaders and executives explores the skills, strategies and mindsets that is needed to thrive in this ever-evolving landscape of the future. So whether you are a seasoned executive, an aspiring leader, or simply curious about the future of leadership, we are here to give you practical insights to unlock your potential, change the status quo, and break open our assumptions on how work works. Produced in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives, Future Fit Leadership is your place for bite-sized learning for executives hungry to make a change. Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. I am your host, Sadhna Smiles, and I hope wherever you are listening to this podcast, you are well. If there's one thing the world needs more of right now, it's optimism, but not the fluffy head in the cloud kind of optimism, but the real practical, infectious optimism that fuels leadership, decision-making, and resilience. Think about it. When was the last time you walked into a room and someone's energy completely lifted you up? That's the power of magnetic optimism. And it's something that today's guest, Victor Perton, has made his life's work. Victor is the founder of the Centre for Optimism, and he has spent years researching and championing the role optimism plays in leadership, business, and even our national identity. And trust me, his energy is contagious. Think about the best leaders you've worked with. Chances are they had an energy that lifted the room. They focused on possibilities over problems. They found solutions where others saw roadblocks, and they knew how to rally people around a vision for the future. That's the power of optimism in leadership. And it's something Victor has spent years researching, teaching, and living. His mission is simple: to help leaders step up with confidence, resilience, and a mindset that sees opportunities, not just obstacles. In a world where uncertainty is the norm and negativity seems to dominate headlines, optimism isn't just a feel-good attitude, it's a leadership necessity. In my conversation with Victor, we explore why optimism is the secret weapon for great leaders and how it can inspire belief and trust in teams, even in the most challenging of times, boost innovation and problem solving by shifting the focus on what is possible, create thriving workplace cultures that attract and retain your top talent, and transform everyday interactions from boardrooms to casual conversations. Interestingly, Victor also shares why Australians, despite living in one of the safest and most successful countries in the world, have become increasingly cynical, and what leaders can do to turn that around. Plus, he's got one simple but game-changing habit that will completely shift how you start your conversations. Hint: it's time to ditch the question, "How are you?" This is a conversation packed with energy, insight, and inspiration, because optimism isn't just nice to have, it's the fuel that drives great leadership. Please enjoy my conversation with Victor Perton. Well, good morning, Victor. Welcome to Future Fit Leadership. How are you today?
I am astonishingly well.
I love it.
What has been the best thing in your day so far?
Well, we had this question offline and I said, well, I woke up. But other than that, today is Thursday, not to date the podcast, but today's Thursday. And this weekend, I have my grandson for the whole weekend with me. So tomorrow, Friday, can't come quick enough. I'm very, very excited to have him for the weekend.
And to be a future fit leader, it's that sense of the future, optimism, the vision of what lies ahead.
It is, isn't it? Because I find that I have a much better day when I focus on things that brings me joy and excitement. And I know there's, terrible things in the day or, things that I have to deal with that are going to stress me out and conversations that I need to have that are going to be, not so nice. But if I just focus on the negative, then I'm actually going to have a very negative mindset for the whole day. So that's kind
The
of how.
genius in what you just said is that word joy.
Mm,
So at the end of 2022, a man from Finland rang me.
right.
He was Andrew Cannon from the Art and Science of Joy. And he said, Victor, we would like you and the Centre for Optimism to be our first superpower of joy for our year of joy. And coming out of that, researching and writing and speaking for them and following them, I'm convinced that the optimist experiences more joy and the joyful are more likely to be optimistic. So if you can just do those little things in the
Mm,
day, even in a tough day, like I was working at the old Parliament House yesterday, and next door there is a beautiful rose garden. And just to walk through that rose garden and get the fragrance of the roses and stop and look at one,
mm,
it lifts you for a long time.
mm. I want to talk about your parents as a start, Victor, because they were both refugees from Latvia and Lithuania, and they survived political prosecution. And your grandmother, I believe, survived 10 years in the Gulag. Tell me more about your grandparents and your parents and, what they went through.
People ask me what makes me optimistic, and I say I think it's 4 generations of guidance.
Mm,
So my father died when I was relatively young, and so my mother is probably the stronger model. So a refugee twice, widowed twice. She kept working and teaching to the age of 92.
wow.
And all those bad experiences as a young teenager having to pack up everything you value in a suitcase
Mm,
and leaving your home overnight because otherwise your entire family faces execution, or being trapped behind the Soviet lines as a 16-year-old and you're talking and walking your way out, being shot at. And she always told those stories with a sense of humor.
mm,
And when I met my grandmother much later, because you couldn't visit her in the old Soviet days, and it wasn't until Perestroika, she was very similar.
mm,
Having spent 12 years in the Gulag, her husband tortured to death, no idea where her son had gone, and yet she took part in those first rallies for freedom. And when the Baltic people stretched hands, held hands, 1 million people over the 3 countries, that she was there. And she was there to celebrate the end of communism in 1991. So
mm,
those two women, having endured great hardship and tragedy and misery, for them to be able to maintain their optimism, their laughter and their joy, and to spread it.
mm,
Mum, taught yoga to hundreds of people, from Catholic nuns to people at the Taxation Commission. And so that notion of spreading contentment and joy. And the other day I had a unique experience. I had dinner with one of the queens and a couple of princesses from Bhutan.
that would have been interesting.
Very interesting. In fact, the one of the princesses had an orange blouse on, very similar to my color. And we started talking about their definition of happiness, because people look at happiness and think, oh, it's that American Bill of Rights. It's,
Mm,
the pursuit of giggles and laughter. And as we talked, it's contentment.
yeah.
What they think of as happiness is to be content with what you've got. Now, it doesn't mean you don't aspire to more, but you don't live your life in misery being jealous of others. And that's the genius of the Bhutanese replacement of gross domestic product
Mm,
with gross domestic happiness.
happiness.
You're not yearning for a house in California. You're happy to live in Bhutan, aspiring to make life better for you, and as you are doing with your little grandson, for the next generation beyond.
Mm. What were the experiences like for your parents coming into Australia? As you said, they were, refugees displaced twice, and so they arrive in Australia very, very different to where they started. What was it like for them?
Well, I think people who have followed the Ukrainian war would know the
Mm,
terror that Russia brought to Europe, and continues to bring to
Continues to do
Europe.
so. Mm.
So to move from Europe to Australia, and they had the choice between the United States and Australia. Mum still, talked about, coming under the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and later she, in one of her jokes, she always said the lovely thing about coming to Australia was people could say bloody Menzies and not be locked up because she'd lived under both Stalin and Hitler.
Yeah.
We're saying bloody Hitler or bloody Stalin would end probably in a death sentence or the Gulag. So number one, again, they brought that humor with them. And then, of course, they arrived in that beautiful harbour and then they ended up in this awful refugee camp.
Mm.
And Mum still laughed for a long time about, her showering in this open shower and then these eyes looked down at her from a tree and she screamed. And of course, it was a possum.
Yeah.
And then they arrived in Melbourne, and it's a one room in a boarding house, and there's vermin there, and they're both professional people. And Dad starts his work here, rolling tires in a tire factory, and Mum working on a machine, and they talk about the generosity of Australians.
Mm.
So Mum, was not physically that strong. So there she is having to work on a press, cutting tires in the stench, and she was pregnant, and how the other women stepped up to help her meet her quota, and that generosity, and then my grandmother, if I can use the word these days, we were the first wogs in the street in East Coburg, and the people in the local church invited my grandmother to morning tea, and that classic Margaret experience where they told her to bring a plate, and she got dressed up and caught the tram to George's in the city and bought a plate and brought
Oh
a plate,
no, bless
not a
her.
plate of food, and so for us, and when Mum was widowed, some people think, oh yes, it's going to be your ethnic community that surrounds you. In fact, it was our Australian neighbours. The hairdresser across the road, and, he would bring us flowers and all sorts of stuff. The fellow next door, a painter, would cut our grass. And so all those things for a young widow to survive, the generosity of those ordinary Australian people who lived around. So for us, the refugee experience was in fact, I think, the classic refugee experience. Every refugee who comes to Australia lifts the average optimism, lifts the average joy. I had the pleasure last year, of being addressing the African Communities Australia Day event.
Mm.
And all the controversy around Australia Day and the like. If ever you've wanted to meet a group of people who are happy to be Australian, happy to be in Australia, it's those people. And in fact, if I can ask you a question, because you're of Fijian origin,
I
and
am.
you've done charity work there around cancer screening for women. So, what was your experience in coming to Australia?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I love the way you've turned this around on me. I arrived here when I was 16 years old, and I'd come out of a very culturally, controlling environment because, I really only had Indian friends and went to a, local school, culturally grew up where, I wasn't allowed out a lot and all that sort of stuff. And so I arrived in Australia, and it's the first time I'd actually lived with so many white people. And I was in boarding school, and I remember for the first probably 4 or 5 months where I was waking up every day with a headache and feeling physically ill because of my environment, because of the experiences I was having in the boarding school, because of the culture shock, the food, the language, the clothing, everything was so different. And I remember one of my guardians one day pulling me aside and having a conversation with me, and she said to me, she said, you need to stand up for yourself. People need to know who you are and what you stand for, because if you don't, they are going to do this to you for the whole 2 years that you're going to be there. So you need to stand up for yourself. And it was probably the best advice that anyone had ever given me at that point in time. And then I started to enjoy my experiences because once I started to stand up for myself, my environment changed and how people treated me changed and the interactions I had changed. And, I found my voice.
I found my personality, and I found that, I had quite a mischievous, naughty side to me, and, I broke all the rules and all that sort of stuff. So it was an interesting experience. And, and then later on in life, I always say to people, and I never forget that I'm a migrant, and I always say I have the best of my Australian life and the best of my Fijian life, and I blend the two together. But I love the freedom we have in this country, where the Prime Minister can go to a football match and sit with everybody and watch the grand final and not and feel safe. And I think that, to me, that has always struck me as we are lucky for those reasons in this country. We are not at war. We don't shoot each other. We don't have drive-by shootings. We don't shoot our children at school. There's a lot to be joyful about in this country.
And you capture that so well. I mean, the security side. Do you remember when Oprah Winfrey came to Australia and met Prime Minister Julia Gillard, and the security detail that Oprah Winfrey brought with her was, I think, 2 or 3 times higher than the security detail for our Prime Minister. And I also remember Malcolm Turnbull when he was Prime Minister visiting Melbourne, and he loved to catch public transport. So he hops on a tram, and all of a sudden, all these CFMEU workers are coming off site. And of course, they were there to do selfies with the Prime Minister.
Oh, yes.
And so that, I think you now, the other thing is laughter. You talk about laughing and laughter. When we did our study of Australian leadership, we interviewed people from Bill George at Harvard through to people on the factory floor. The 3 characteristics that make an Australian leader rather than a global leader is, one, egalitarianism. That notion we talk to the cleaner the same way we talk to the chairman, the notion that our Prime Minister can go to the football and stay in the stand, or the Prime Minister can catch the tram, and people will bundle on to say hello. The second one is self-deprecating humor. That laughing at ourselves. And the third one is that no bullshit. I had a Russian senior figure at the G20 say, Victor, I never die wondering what you think. And that's a good thing. And so we've got that sort of transparency, where people know
Yeah.
that an Aussie. So when I worked in America as a trade commissioner, it was my superpower was the stereotype that Americans have, and not just North Americans, Brazilians, Chileans, Colombians all have the same view that Australians are relentless optimists. And we're the sort of person you want to have a beer with, or of course, if you're in Peru, a pisco with, um, or go to a barbecue. And I was once in the presence of Governor Perry of Texas, who said, we Texans are the lost tribe of Australia. So, in fact, our joyfulness, our optimism is so strong that even those very proud Texans aspire to be a tribe of
Aspire to
Australia.
be Australians, tribe of
Maybe we
Australia.
should offer them the seventh statehood. If Trump's going to take Canada, maybe
Yeah,
Texas
we
wants
should
to
take
join us.
Texas. Talking about politics, I don't know if many people listening to this would remember, but you were part of the Kennett government in Victoria. How did your personality, because you're a very optimistic man, you see the positive in just about everything. How did you go in politics?
I did very well. I didn't reach the top office. And yeah, there's a whole lot of sort of probably, personal stories there that I wouldn't share on a podcast. But once Jeff Kennett leaned over to John Brumby in the Parliament and said, I get more opposition from Perton than I do from you. So, that notion of no bullshit and, you've got to stand up for what you believe in. So, in fact, in many senses, Victoria then was like Victoria now, deep in debt. The election of the Kennett government in 92 and its re-election in 1995, huge majorities, because you actually had an opposition coming to power with a plan that said it's going to be tough, but we're going to rebuild. And of course, that rebuilding was so successful that Melbourne, for instance, became the world's most livable city, 7 years running on the Economist Intelligent Ranking. So we went from, a reputation of the rust bucket of Australia, to a city that people around the world aspire to. And we still have that legacy. Americans want to come here for the tennis. Any American golfer wants to go and play at Royal Melbourne. They know our food, they know our wine. So that experience in the Kennett government toughened me up. It taught me that my form of liberalism is not everyone's form of liberalism. And if I can bore your listeners for a moment, the phrase I love about liberalism comes from a small book called Liberalism by Hobhouse, 1911. And he talks about liberalism as the liberation of living spiritual energy. Now, it was an interesting historical phase because Deakin and a whole lot of those guys were deeply spiritual. So that notion of liberation, as you talked about, freedom,
Freedom.
liberation of living spiritual energy. And then the other way it was phrased, so I think Menzies was also inspired this. And Menzies, of course, founded the Australian Liberal Party after really, really tough times in the 40s, when he'd lost his prime ministership and lost his party and created this new thing called the Liberal Party. And this was a lovely piece of leadership. He said, "We called the party liberal, not conservative, because we were determined to be progressive, not reactionary, believing in the individual, their rights, and their enterprise."
Mm.
And so again, there's this, for me, that was it. Now, the Liberal Party, like the Labor Party, when you've only got two parties in a country, really, there's such a broad spread. So I used to run foul of the Conservatives and the right-wing reactionaries. And I probably, if I lived that time again, I'd probably react differently.
Yeah.
But I was very, very firmly attached to the way I spoke. So it both set me up for the rest of my life. I now model myself on Kissinger. I want to write my last book at the age of 98. I still want to be valued for a bit of insight and wisdom at the age of 99. But I would probably do my politics a little bit differently.
So that you then went off and started the Centre of Optimism. What made you do that?
So in between times, so remember I referred to the former Labor Premier, John Brumby. After I left politics, I had a little entrepreneurial business in giving advice on good regulation and regulation involving tech. And he then approached me to ask whether I would be interested in the role of Commissioner to the Americas. So trade and investment, inward investment, outward trade in North and South America. And it was a spectacular 3 years. As I said
What
earlier,
made it spectacular?
number one was that stereotype of Australians.
Mm.
You could walk into a McDonald's and people would say, "Don't understand a word you're saying, but keep talking, please." So immediate friendliness. And number two, being a salesman for Australia.
Mm.
Whether I went to Indianapolis to visit Eli Lilly or Peoria to visit Caterpillar or New York to visit Alcoa, Northern Trust, it was a sales message. And I love sales. So number one for me, any salesman listening in, revel in what you do. There is almost no greater calling because it's the essence of podcasts. It's the essence of politics. So that was spectacular 3 years because even though I was there during the global financial crisis, people still eat, people still drink, people still making investment plans. And then after that, I fell into even greater fortune. I joined the G20 task force for the Australian presidency. And again, at that super elite level of presidents and prime ministers and finance ministers and central bank governors, it was exactly the same. It's almost as if they believe in reincarnation, they want to come back an Aussie.
Yeah.
And again, the simple pleasures of holding a barbecue reception on the Governor General's lawn for ultra VIPs and, having a French delegate, I've been briefed, don't use the word champagne when you're talking about Australian sparkling. And she said, "Oh, I love this Australian champagne." All of those wonderful things. And then I came back to Melbourne and I was stunned by the negativity of language. So maybe I had changed from living in California, from, being a salesman around the world for Aussie values. I was really surprised at how negative Australian language had become. And everyone jokes about politicians. It doesn't matter whether you're North Korean, Russian, Australian. We all, political leadership, everyone mocks. But this was deeper, and your podcast goes to these questions. of why why are Australians so cynical, so mocking of leadership? I played around. Is it language? Is leadership a German American concept? Is it not our sort of thing? So rather than complain about the complainers, I set up a project called the Australian Leadership Project.
Mm-hmm.
And we interviewed 2,500 people. And the essence of the question is, what's good Australian leadership? Who's a leader who's inspired you? And again, I gave you the three qualities of Aussie leadership: egalitarianism, self-effacing humour, and no bullshit. The other funny finding, which was replicated by Gallup in a global thing last year, is do you know where people find their inspiring leadership?
At home.
At home. In home and in family.
Yeah, I've read that. It's interesting, isn't it? That because it's not, a president or anything like that.
No.
It's actually in family.
And all those billions of dollars we spend on leadership training, maybe we've just got to get people to tell stories about the people they met at home and in their family. So that was number one. But at the end of the project, I was still left bewildered as to why Aussies had become so negative. And my lucky moment came later that year. I was a speaker on the final panel at the Global Integrity Summit. And 3 days of miserable conversation, doomerism, and everything else, I changed my speech to the case for optimism. And it electrified the room. And Helen Clark, who was then the head of the UNDP, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, said, Victor, turn that into a book and I will endorse it. So I wrote the book, and that created a global speaking tour, Phoenix, Madrid, all sorts of places. And then the next year, or in fact, a little bit later, 18 months later, a Labor minister in a state unnamed asked me to do a project on innovation. And I said, you don't need to pay me. I'd just like you to make a speech on the connection between optimism and innovation. Well, I didn't know this person was the greatest pessimist in the Labor Party. And they, in very fruity language, so I can't use the F's and the things, but the message to me was, well, what could the government do that Victor Perton himself can't do better globally? And that night was born the Centre for Optimism. And our fundamental research is what makes you optimistic? And we've asked over 40,000 people. We've generated hundreds of thousands of people asking other people what makes you optimistic. And you asked me earlier up, where does my optimism come from? And I say it's 4 generations. It's life experience. It's joy. It's a bit of spirituality. There's some meditation wrapped up in it. And of course, it's daily practices. I know the practices that help to make you optimistic. And one for your listeners is get rid of the question, how are you? And replace it with what's been the best thing in your day.
Which is what you asked me as soon as we started this podcast. You asked me that or similar question to that.
Yeah. And so our fundamental research says that you can't lecture people to be optimistic. You think of Bill Gates and the like, and they keep telling you we've halved the malaria death rate, we've got rid of polio, and yet people remain pessimistic. And the Dalai Lama, who I had the honor of an audience a couple of years ago, said in respect of teenagers, well, you can't tell a teenager to be optimistic, you can only model it. And so our question, which is what makes you optimistic, can even be answered by a pessimist. So I said, I threatened you with this question when we were originally talking about it. What makes you optimistic? Is it your life experience? Is it your mindset? Is it your faith or spirituality? What is it that makes you such an infectiously optimistic leader that people not only follow you, but they honor you?
I think it's a combination of all of those things. It's life experiences, absolutely. It's the mindset that I have. It's my desire to bring a certain energy to the room that I walk into, and the conversations that I have and the interactions that I have. I always say to people, be aware of what they say about you when you're in the room and be aware of what they say about you when you're not in the room. And I do want people to say when I'm not in the room, she's great to be around, And it's more than the glass half empty or the glass half full. I probably see an opportunity in most things. When people come to me with problems, I'm the first one with a solution, or, always looking for a solution, always looking for the best in people. So there's probably a whole range of things that makes me an optimist. But it's not an everyday thing, I don't know whether you agree with this or not, but you do have to work at it. I mean, there've been times in my life where I have hit rock bottom, and trying to be that person every day has been really, really difficult. Things happen. When my dad died in 2020, and it was a big shock to the family, it took me a long, long time to get back into what I felt was normal again. But that was was quite a shock to my system. I had a divorce and all those sorts of things. But, I think if you've got some of the practices in place, then you can tap back into it at some point in time when you do hit a road bump.
Yeah, and grief is normal.
Mm,
Grief is
mm,
normal.
mm.
These days people are trying to reframe it as a mental illness or the like.
Yeah.
Each of us will go through, the death of parents. Yesterday, in my daughter's schooling, a very close friend of hers had died overnight, a teenage boy, and
Mhm.
the job of all we parents was, in fact, to make sure that the teenagers were together and supporting each other. So that point you make, I'd probably challenge. I say we've actually written quite a lot of material on the optimist experiencing grief and the optimist comforting people in grief.
Mm,
And so Viktor Frankl, the German psychotherapist, who experienced the Holocaust, although he survived, wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. For me, the most important thing about Man's Search for Meaning is the addendum he added called the chapter called Tragic Optimism. And in some senses, it's like the American novel Pollyanna and the 1960 film with Haley Mills, Pollyanna. It's looking for the light in whatever you are. So it's not saying that there's a silver lining in a dark cloud.
mm. I like that.
You
It's
think
looking for
of
the light.
Syria, chemical bombing its people.
Mm,
We can think of the controversial, the Gazan war,
mm,
Gaza, reduced to rubble, or the continuing war. There's nothing good out of an apartment building in Kyiv being hit by a rocket or by a thing. However, the optimist looks for the next.
mm,
And you see it in these experiences of Ukrainian soldiers and children who've lost limbs, and people who are building new limbs and AI powered limbs. And exactly as you said, these are dark things. There are people there who are trying to make it better. And you even think of the terrible fighting in Sudan and what's going on in the Congo. I have a friend, Rashidi, who's raising funds and getting equipment to put a hospital in East Congo, and all you see on the news is this evil and the horror and terror. And yet here's this guy, living between Shepparton and Melbourne, a refugee from the Congo, and he's busy, busy, busy
mm.
collecting medical equipment, and getting it into a container to send it to the Congo. I've got to say, Rashidi is one of the great optimists.
So you've written that infectious optimism is the key to effective leadership in the 2020s. What, and particularly from a leadership perspective, what does infectious optimism look like in leadership?
In fact, in my master classes, and I'm delivering a master class to the public service this same day, magnetic optimism, and I think you are getting very close to it. My definition of magnetic optimism is an optimism so tangible and a vision so compelling that people want to reach out and touch it or touch you. So that's my highest aspiration. And I've actually, funnily enough, in the Pacific Islands, I've had a number of women entrepreneurs gather as a group, and we've talked about that. So infectious optimism is that ability of yours to lift other people into optimism. And just before Christmas, I had a meeting with a very senior government official, and she was heading off to her planning meeting later that day with her assistants and the like and other senior folk. And I said, try something new. At the beginning of the meeting, ask them what has brought them joy this year and what are they optimistic for next year. And she went round the table. She said it was the best meeting
Mm.
she ever experienced. That same week, I had the opportunity to speak for 45 minutes to an audience of about 50 people. And I said to them, well, I could talk to you for 45 minutes, but I would rather each and every one of you, if you're up to it, share what has brought you joy this year and what makes you optimistic next year. And for me, that's the infection. I have all sorts of habits. So one of the habits is genuinely smile at everyone you pass.
Mm.
And if you can say hello, it's just such a little thing. The science is so strong about we smiling lifts our spirits, receiving a smile. Number two is what we talked about earlier. Like in Australia, I know your listeners are all around the world, but many countries, people open a conversation with, how are you?
Mhm.
And in Australia and Austria and Ireland, people say, not bad or not too bad. And where does it take you? Very few people as cheeky as me who say, well, I hope you've got a higher standard than that.
Yeah. Or
And
they
so,
say, how was your day? And they say, oh, it was okay.
yeah, yeah. And so what I have been teaching people from prisoners, some of the most serious hardcore prisoners, to people in supermarkets is get rid of that question, how are you, with that awful answer you get in Australia, and replace it with what's been the best thing in your day. And
Mm.
if your listeners can try it for the next 2 days, and they can't see my gesture, but I'm going to slap my forehead and imagine next time you say, G'day, how are you? And someone says, not bad or not too bad, you're going to think, Victor said that was a bloody wasted question. And if you ask, what's been the best thing in your day? Most people will pause because they're a bit confused, having to think in a greeting. The evidence is so strong. In fact, I was even in my supermarket a few months ago, and one of the ladies behind the checkout, she said, "You are my favorite customer because every time you come in here, you lift me."
Yeah, because
Every
you asked what was the best thing in your day.
What's it? And I go to a cafe called Hurricane Handsome, which is obviously not named after me. I'm treated like royalty because the waiters and the waitresses are used to me asking that question, what's been the best thing in your day or your week? And also my gratitude. When I'm leaving, I always stick my head in the kitchen, thank the Nepalese Australian chef. I stop at the barista, say thank you. I love that coffee and the latte art was beautiful. And of course I thank. And so again, that simple third practice of gratitude. And people get caught up in gratitude journals and journaling. The simplest thing is just to say thank you
Thank
by
you.
way of WhatsApp, an SMS message, whatever social media you use, or face to face.
Mm.
However, the gratitude journal has merit. Um, and the trick for those who haven't tried it is just when you've got into your pajamas or your nightie or whatever you wear in bed or not wear, by your bedside, just have a pad or even better still, a beautiful journal and just scribble down a line for each of the three best things in the day. And it could be as simple as, I was on a brilliant podcast today, with a wonderful hostess, or I had a lovely coffee, or my teenage girl, gave me a hug. And the trick with it is not just to write it down, but the next morning, don't wake up to an alarm with the news. Don't wake up to anything else, whether you're sitting on the toilet first up or whether you're having a cup of tea or coffee, read what you wrote yesterday. And you may even start flicking back. And it's almost like some people recommend, every time something really good happens, writing it down and throwing it in a jar. And when you feel miserable, pulling a couple of those good things
I've
out.
done that before. I did
Yeah.
that for a whole year with my kids. We wrote down everything that happened that was fantastic. And then we pulled it out a year, at the end of the year, and we read it and was like, oh my God, we've forgotten half the things that happened this year. What,
Right, kind of just two more
yeah,
if you're there
please.
time. Another one that I really love is my best self. So your listeners, if it's on your notes, they can get it from there, or they can just Google My Best Self and Victor Perton or Centre for Optimism. And what you do is either you want wine or whiskey or beer or a cup of tea or a glass of kombucha, and you imagine yourself 5 years hence.
Mm.
So imagine yourself this day, 2030. What am I going to be doing work-wise? Am I on holidays? What is the best day I can imagine in 5 years' time? And assume the family's going to be okay, your friends are going to be okay, society will not have collapsed. And then you spend 5 to 10 minutes writing a diary entry for that day,
Mm.
that day, and do doodles and pictures, whatever you like, and then just go for a walk. Now, the evidence around this is so strong because the thought pattern will keep coming back. And, for those of your listeners who run businesses or chambers of commerce, I did this at B Bendigo Chamber of Commerce, and they said, will you do this with us live? And up until then, I'd always done it, individual exercise. Anyway, 64 out of the 65 people in the room shared what they would be doing in 5 years. And the laughter and the joy and the I'm going to have sold my business and I'm going to be sitting on a beach in Tahiti was, well, why are we going to wait there? Let's go to Tahiti this year.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
2 years later, many of those aspirations have already manifested themselves. So that practice, My Best Self, I do it online with several hundred people every 3 months for the change of the season, something to do every 3 months. And then the last one I'd commend to your listeners is My Optimism Superpower. And again, you can Google it. And I've got about 150 types of optimism. I'm a radical optimist. My gender pronouns are Pollyanna optimist. But you can be a cautious optimist, or like you, a glass overflowing optimist, a sparkling optimist, an infectious optimist, a magnetic. And then you write a paragraph um, on how that manifests in your life. And I did it. We were talking earlier before we went online about doing this with a real estate conference. And about 25 people around the table at this one. And one of the blokes said, oh, yeah, look, I'm an optimist. My parents were so miserable and so pessimistic, and they'd watch the television, and the Prime Minister was an idiot, and the Leader of the Opposition was an idiot, and the commentator was an idiot. Everyone was an idiot. And he said, I'm never going to be like that. I'm going to be an optimist. And one of the other women at the table put her hand straight up. And she said, exactly the same. I had pessimistic parents. I said, I'm never going to be like that. So I think the message out of those two people is you can come from the most pessimistic parents and the most miserable of circumstances and turn yourself into an optimist, an infectious optimist, and maybe even like you, a magnetic optimist.
Oh, I like that. I've never been called that before. I'm going to use that over and over again. Victor, what is in your own journey of optimism to being where you are today? And I have to say, like, I've met you a couple of times now, and even online, the energy you bring to the conversations lifts you up. You can't help but be lifted by what you share. But what has been the most surprising thing you've learned in your journey so far?
Well, that's a very good question. It's a very good question. You're the first person to ask me that question. What has surprised me? I think the extent to which it's needed,
Mm.
and also the impact I can have at even the most senior levels. I had a guy who was the head of PR in one of our largest corporations, and I just sent a little note to say, well done and best wishes. And he wrote back and he said, well, you will never know the extent of the influence your optimism has had.
Mm.
So it was a clear message that, within that corporation, it had been used. And, we wrote our narrative for a positive Australia, and we gave it to the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition of the day. And we were so happy to start to see the word optimism and optimistic appear in their speeches.
Mm.
And I went to, in fact, I've written an essay on this. I went to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa in October.
Mm.
And I won't go through chapter and verse. I've sort of got about a 10-minute funny story about this, but the essence of it was I'd written to the King, I'd written to the Secretary General to say Samoan culture is optimistic. If you're going to Samoa, use Samoan
Mm.
to lift the Commonwealth. And of course, because everyone's obsessed with resilience, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
miserable form of resilience, the
Okay. Yep.
world is going to shit, and yeah, we're miserably going to get our way through it. And it's all the fault of Australia and the
Mm.
Western world for everything we suffer. And I thought, oh gosh, I haven't won through, resilience, and it's not an optimistic resilience because optimism is the key to resilience. You can't
Mm.
be resilient.
Without optimism.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
why would you persist unless you thought things
Yeah.
were going to get better? I mean, the definition of optimism is a belief that good things will happen and that things will work out in the end.
Mm.
And so, but funnily enough, I got an invitation to the People's Forum and then to the Business Forum. And you'll laugh at this. The Prime Minister of Samoa had said, ditch your suits. So I took her literally and took my most colourful Samoan shirts, my fluorescent green Crocs. And I turned up at the People's Forum, and the first panel was this miserable, the world's going to hell and no one's listening to us. So at the end of the panel, I got up and I said, well, this is the most miserable first panel I could have imagined for the People's Forum. What about each of you speakers and the moderator telling me what makes you optimistic?
Mm.
Well, they all fell over themselves to be optimistic. And at the end of the day, the moderator said, my takeaway from today, and she's the sort of Bahamian version of the Bondi vet, sort of
Yes.
very beautiful and articulate. And she said, my takeaway is optimism is the key.
Mm.
Next morning, she opens with optimism is the key. Well, at this point, I'm thinking, well, I've achieved everything I want to achieve. Then day three, I won't name them all, but one of my friends was moderating a panel with a president, a prime minister, one of the most senior foreign ministers in the world, the head of one of the biggest shipping lines in the world. And I said, Andrew, you can see that I'm in this very colourful Samoan shirt and my fluorescent Crocs in the midst of these dark suited African and Commonwealth leaders. If you don't ask about optimism, I'll
Mm.
embarrass you because I'm part of your delegation.
Yeah.
At the end of this president's speech, Andrew said, if I can summarize your speech, Mr. President, it's optimism is the key. And then the Cayman Islands Prime Minister got up and she said, well, I'd go even further. I believe in the audacity of optimism. Well, at this point, I'm ecstatic. I think, God, I've achieved everything I want to achieve by coming to Samoa. And then it got better. Day four, the Secretary General welcoming the King said, I thank the King for his wise advice. I thank him for his optimistic advice. Well,
Mm.
at that point, again, I'm
My
in.
work here is done.
But what should happen day five? The communique from the Commonwealth heads of government for the first time in history, the heads of government committed to restoring hope and optimism in
Mm.
our common future. Now,
Mm.
was that my influence? I'll never know. But unless you give it a go,
Yeah.
you'll never know.
You'll never
And
know.
so for me, was it surprising? Yeah, in retrospect, you putting the question in that way, it was surprising. For me, I'd say it was joy and ecstasy.
Mm. What's next for the Centre of Optimism? And you just listening to your stories, and I reckon you could tell me stories all day of the experiences you've had in your life so far. But what's next for you and the Centre of Optimism?
It's an interesting period of exploration for us because we've been very successful. We've got 7,000 members in 82 countries. So it really, I can't answer that question of what's next. If I look at projects, we've got middle of the year, I sponsor the Nelson Mandela Youth Leadership Summit. So it's been 2 years in Shepparton for refugee and migrant youth, then 2 years in online to a worldwide group of kids, then 2 years in the Victorian Parliament for that mixture of refugee, migrant, country, inner urban kids. And then the African community has asked me with Rashidi to take it to Canberra this year.
Mm.
So that will be interesting. I'm meeting the right sort of people and asking people to get involved. So that's probably number one is making that a really extraordinary and meaningful experience. Number two is my personal passion for turning that CHOGM, Commonwealth Heads of Government statement into reality. So I'm pestering heads of state and I'm pestering the Commonwealth to how do we make that real? And then an interesting request from the Bhutanese, and I can't really act on it. I've got a daughter doing VCE, so staying close to home in Melbourne is important to me this year. So for those who are overseas and elsewhere, VCE is the last year of school. Um, the Bhutanese were really, really interested in what we're doing because just as we have this problem of youth being optimistic for themselves but pessimistic for their country and the world, it's a global problem. So Tharman, the president of Singapore, has in fact said that is the biggest public policy problem in the world, the collapse of optimism in the developed world. And I don't know if you know the infrastructure company GHD.
No.
They did a really interesting study. It was oddly phrased question, asking people about their trust in leaders to do the right thing for 30 years hence. So maybe it was that infrastructure sort of lens. What was shocking to them was that the countries that were lowest were Australia and New Zealand, the United Kingdom, the United States, and they described it as the Anglosphere. So one of the other things I'm wrestling with, and I've had some meetings with the people who are on the democracy task force in the Department of Home Affairs, I think for us as Australians, I think one of our big challenges is that we've gone from being the most optimistic country in the world to very much in the middle ranking. All of the surveys are showing that young people remain relatively optimistic for themselves and their future, particularly refugee and migrant youth. If you interview a refugee kid or a migrant kid, like you were, they are the most optimistic Australians. So every migrant that comes in, that what we've got to wrestle with is this pessimism for the nation and the world. And just as we've seen in America and the like, this attack on the values of democracy, there's evidence now that says those who are most dissatisfied with Australian democracy are those who are most dissatisfied with their own lives. And the Organisation for Economic Development in Paris, which is of course now headed up by a Belgian Australian, Matthias Cormann, their research in 28 countries on school kids shows that optimism is the key trait associated with life satisfaction. So if we join all those dots, you've got an attack on democracy by people who are most dissatisfied in their own lives, and optimism is the key. So we need to foster optimism. And I did an event in Armidale a couple of years ago. We called it Spring into Optimism, and we brought 50 teenagers from schools there in Moree. It's that sort of thing that I think we need to do more of. And, you know, the more you can get out and speak to those teenagers and lift their spirits. So I think defending democracy is a big part of it. And doing that, it's joining the dots. And then a funny little quirky one. I'm on the board of Yarra Valley Water and on the board of Vic Water. And I'm the ambassador for the Intelligent Water Network. And given they're such an intelligent group, I think they made their dumbest member the ambassador. One of the interesting things that's happening in Australia is the level of drugs in our wastewater. What people are peeing and pooing is full of antidepressants,
Right.
anti-anxiety drugs. You know, the headline in the newspaper is, you know, heroin and cocaine and the like. But in fact, that is a relatively small problem compared to the problem of pharmaceuticals. And Australia, this country of sunshine, and as you said earlier, it's so safe. Our prime ministers can just walk around the streets, or you know that funny point you made on organised crime. I was once having coffee at Florentino with a friend from Sydney, and one of the most notorious organised crime figures in Melbourne arrived with his bodyguards and sat on a cafe, a table outside. And my friend Peter said, God, you wouldn't see that in Sydney.
No,
And you couldn't
no.
imagine seeing that in Rio de Janeiro
Or America or anywhere.
anywhere else. So,
Yeah.
so even our organised crime figures feel safe enough. But for me, it's connecting the dots. Why are our doctors prescribing so many antidepressants. And you talked about your grief earlier at the death of your father. People are being prescribed antidepressants for grief.
Mm.
So we've now got, in a country that should not have the highest level of depression, we've got the highest level of anti-anxiety drugs getting into our wastewater, getting into our rivers, impacting on animals. So I actually had an interesting meeting with people in the environment space the other day thinking, is there a systems-based or holistic solution to this? You know, can we take a little region and explore whether we can talk to the doctors about prescribing drugs that
Is it
persist
because
less?
is it because we've become a society where we feel that the pill is supposed to fix everything?
Yeah.
Like one little pill will fix everything. If I feel a bit up, down, whatever it feels like, I'll go to the doctor, he'll prescribe me something and I'll be okay again.
Well, if as you know, I'm carrying a bit of weight, and one injection a week will
Mm,
take the weight off. A
mm,
pill will stop your grief.
mm.
Um, all of these things. You're quite right. Now, that's deeply entrenched in our system because we've got the PBS, so a drug that would cost you 200 a month in the US, probably only costs you 15 or 20 bucks. So,
Mm.
you've got this, supply demand interesting, phenomenon. People would say cheap drugs are good, but if you're prescribing too many cheap drugs and it's getting into the wastewater system, it's
Having
bad.
a
So that's
yeah.
another, it's one that's not really Centre for Optimism. It's really Victor Perton, optimist, interested in clean water. So that's another of the projects. But if you invite me back maybe later in the year or
Happy to
early
do that.
next year,
Yep. Yep.
I will be better able to say we've done really well, having established during COVID,
Yeah.
to have 7,000 people in 82 countries, probably 100,000 on social media. There are days, when we get more people watching us than the ABC or the Age or the Sydney Morning Herald. So we've got to a good point. But if we want to change the thinking of 1 million people or 1 billion people,
Mm.
that needs to be. So any of your listeners who wants to help me that vision, can we make 1 billion more people more infectiously optimistic? Or maybe let's start with, or maybe we've already made 1 million more people more optimistic, we don't know. And if we rise to the challenge of, say, Penny Mordaunt, do you remember her? She was the lady in blue who carried the sword for King Charles. And she almost became Prime Minister of England. I think she
Hmm.
came third. And she said, the great battle in politics today is not between left and right, it's between the optimists and the pessimists. And we need the optimists
To
for the
win.
challenges ahead. So for
Mm.
me, if I can help 1 billion people or 100 million people or 10 million people do that, so that's a challenge to your listeners. Anyone who wants to help us make that a reality, you're welcome to the fold. You too can be a radical optimist, an infectious optimist, a magnetic optimist, or like me, a Pollyanna optimist. That's the challenge I send out. And remember that other thing I said to them? Smile and say hello to everyone you pass, even if they're on the phone and they've got earpods. If they ignore you, well, not everyone's going to react. And that other one, try this for the next 2 days. Do not ask anyone, how are you? Remember, Victor slapped his forehead and said, what a waste of a question. Ask everyone you meet, what's been the best thing in your day? Or, in the alternative, if you see a lot of them, what's brought you joy today? And after that real estate conference you talked about that we were both at in Sydney, one of the CEOs wrote to me and he said, I go around asking my staff, what brings you joy? And I keep thinking, well, if the boss is going to ask you what brings you joy, boy, are you going to think about it.
You're going to think about it. Well, Victor, you've brought joy to my day today, and I'm sure you'll be bringing joy to the listeners when they listen to this podcast. Thank you so much for your time. It really has been an absolute pleasure having you on to chat to you, and all the best with your journey to get 1 billion people optimistic.
And to you in your wonderful journey, what you've done for the women of Fiji, that notion of walk a mile in my shoes. God, what an evocative phrase. So I think you have to make that judgment yourself as to whether you're a magnetic optimist, that optimism so tangible and that vision so compelling. It's why people admire you and why I'm so grateful that you've taken the time with me today.
Thank you, Victor. Chat soon.
If you like what you've heard, please share, rate and review this podcast, and don't forget to share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing it. The producer of Future Fit Leadership is Maritza Barone from Guide Your Light Network. If you would like to reach out to me, please DM me on any of my social media platforms. I'm available for speaking at conferences or consulting to your business. Future Fit is created in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives. If you'd like to join the community and receive a free takeaway each week, sign up to the Future Exchange app in my show notes. Thank you for having me in your space.
This is a Guide Your Light Network production, creating podcasts with purpose.